How does a civilization go from unstoppable conquest to complete extinction, not over centuries, but within a single lifetime? The Assyrian Empire wasn't just powerful, it was terrifying. Their armies didn't march, they descended like thunderclouds made of bronze and iron. Cities surrendered before a single spear was thrown. Kings knelt, not out of diplomacy but out of raw, paralyzing fear. And yet, within decades, this empire, the first true empire in human history, was reduced to smoldering ruins. Its palaces were looted, its kings forgotten, its heartland erased from the map. This is the story of Assyria, the world's first empire. A civilization that revolutionized warfare, pioneered infrastructure, mastered administration, and ruled with terror so absolute, neighboring kings gave up without swinging a sword. But their greatest strength would become their greatest weakness. Their unquenchable thirst for conquest created a machine too big to sustain. By the end, Assyria wasn't just fighting enemies, it was fighting itself. And when it finally fell, it fell so hard that history buried it for centuries. Let's unravel the story of Assyria, from its sacred beginnings to its apocalyptic end. Long before siege towers and imperial decrees, long before the gods of Ashur were etched into palace walls, the people who would one day call themselves Assyrians were nomads. Pastoral Semitic tribes roaming the vast green savannas of prehistoric Arabia. This region, now defined by endless desert, was once fertile, alive with grazing lands and seasonal rivers. It supported a lifestyle based on mobility, herding, and clan-based alliances. But nature, as it always does, changed the rules. Between 2500 and 2000 BCE, shifting climate patterns dried the savanna. Water sources vanished, grasslands turned to dust, entire communities were uprooted, and a mass migration northward began. Some tribes drifted into the Levant and Palestine. Others crossed into the lands of Sumer and Akkad, the river-fed world of Mesopotamia. These were not empty lands, but advanced, literate societies. And unlike most invaders who came to destroy, these Semitic newcomers learned, adapted, and assimilated. In central Mesopotamia, along the middle course of the Tigris River, small settlements began to take shape. Ashur, Nineveh, Erbil. These cities were initially unremarkable. They sat in the shadow of great southern powers like Ur, Babylon, and Akkad. Yet their location, right on the artery connecting the Sumerian south to the Anatolian highlands, was strategic. Trade moved along these rivers. So did information. So did power. Ashur in particular began as a trading post, not a military stronghold. Its rise wasn't forged in conquest, but in commerce. Merchants from Ashur established colonies deep in modern-day Turkey, setting up outposts like Kurum Kanesh, where they dealt in tin, textiles, copper, and precious stones. These merchants weren't just traders, they were cultural ambassadors. They kept detailed records in cuneiform script, signed contracts, ran international networks, and brought back not only wealth, but influence. What made this phase of Assyrian history unique was that it grew not from kingship, but from the city itself. The name Ashur wasn't just geographic, it was divine. The city and its god shared the same name and identity. In the minds of its citizens, the city was the god, and the god was the land. The ruler of Ashur was not a king in the traditional sense, but the earthly steward of the god's domain, a caretaker serving under divine authority. The governance of Ashur reflected this ideology. Power was limited. Decisions were made through a city council of elders, with a rotating office called the Limu, an annually appointed official who oversaw civic and financial matters. The Limu's name would mark each year, allowing us to reconstruct Assyria's chronology. It was a society grounded in structure, law, and shared civic responsibility, a stark contrast to the image of later Assyrian absolutism. But while Ashur's prosperity grew through peaceful trade, it would not remain untouched by the storms brewing in the wider Mesopotamian world. The rise and fall of regional empires, Ur-Thur, early Babylon, cast long shadows. And eventually the same highways that brought wealth would also bring war. Ashur had grown wealthy but not yet powerful. Its merchants carried influence, but its rulers lacked armies. For generations, the Assyrian cities existed under the long shadows of greater empires, first under the Sumerians, then Akkadians, and eventually the kings of Babylon. Independence was fleeting. Even at its height as a trading hub, Ashur often bowed to foreign overlords who wielded greater military strength. But the most defining period of subjugation came during the rise of the Mitanni, a powerful, Hurrian-speaking kingdom from the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey and northern Syria. In the 16th century BCE, the Mitanni established a firm grip over northern Mesopotamia. Assyria wasn't conquered through war, it was suppressed through political control. Its walls were deliberately dismantled by Mitanni authority, leaving the city defenseless. Representatives from Mitanni sat on Ashur's own council, monitoring decisions and stifling autonomy. There was no open rebellion, but there was no freedom either. What made this period unique is how much the Assyrians absorbed while they were under foreign domination. They studied their overlords, learned their military strategies, and quietly integrated foreign technology. From the Mitanni, they adopted the light war chariot, a mobile unit that revolutionized battlefield tactics in the Near East. They studied composite bows, which could pierce armor at great distances, and lamellar armor, a flexible reinforced defense worn by elite warriors. These were not passive years, they were an education. Still, Assyria remained a minor regional power for nearly 2 centuries. It existed, but barely. Nominally independent, but in practice, muzzled. There was no king, only a governor, still answering to Ashur the god, but in reality, under Mitanni rule. But the silence would not last. By the 15th century BCE, cracks began to form in the Mitanni state. Internal conflicts, dynastic disputes, and pressure from neighboring powers, especially the Hittites, began to pull the kingdom apart. And from within the quiet city of Ashur, a new figure emerged. Ashur-bel-nisheshu, the first ruler in generations to act with defiance. He seized the moment, rebuilding Ashur's walls, an audacious move, nearly a declaration of war in itself. Remarkably, the Mitanni didn't retaliate. They couldn't. Too distracted by their own turmoil. This gave Assyria the space it needed to reassert itself. Soon after, Ashurubal I expelled the remaining Mitanni officials, declared himself king, not governor, and, for the first time, placed Assyria on the regional stage as a sovereign state. This was more than a political shift. It was a transformation in identity. No longer did the Assyrians see themselves as the keepers of a single city. They were now the stewards of a land, a nation. The god Ashur was not just a protector of one place, but a universal deity whose will extended beyond the Tigris River. This idea would reshape everything: governance, religion, warfare, and diplomacy. But independence came with new enemies and new ambitions. The vassal had become a kingdom, and soon it would set its sights on empire. The rebirth of Assyria as an independent kingdom did not merely change its borders, it redefined its soul. With the fall of Mitanni control and the coronation of kings like Ashurubal I, the Assyrians shed the skin of a cautious trading city and began to clothe themselves in the armor of war. The ideology shifted dramatically. Ashur was no longer just the guardian of a city, but now the god of a people with a divine mission to bring order to a chaotic world, even if that order had to be carved through blood. This belief wasn't metaphorical, it became the backbone of Assyrian political thought. The land of Assyria, Mat Ashur, was sacred. Everything outside it was considered hostile, disorderly, even blasphemous. Expanding the borders wasn't imperialism, it was divine obligation. This marked the beginning of what historians recognize as the Assyrian imperial mindset. To conquer was to serve the gods. And so, kings began to define their legacy not through lineage or piety, but through military conquest. Titles grew longer and more extravagant. Rulers styled themselves as kings of the universe, stewards of Ashur, and subjugators of the four quarters. These weren't just grandiose epithets, they were political manifestos carved into stone. With ideology sharpened, the sword followed. The Assyrian military rapidly evolved from a loose militia into an increasingly specialized fighting force. Early in this transformation, the army relied on infantry supported by chariotry, but even in these formative stages, Assyrian warfare was characterized by discipline, siege expertise, and brutality. Campaigns were seasonal at first, conducted during the spring and summer, but they were relentless. Every year, armies marched out not only to conquer new lands, but to reinforce vassalage, collect tribute, and punish rebellion. The kings during this phase, particularly Adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I, were not just warriors, but architects of the state. Under their reigns, Assyria pushed outward, absorbing what remained of Mitanni, clashing with the Kassites of Babylonia, and confronting the Hittites in the north. These conquests weren't mere raids. They were the foundations of territorial expansion, with governors installed, tribute systems enforced, and Assyrian culture seeded into foreign soil. The war machine required innovation, and the Assyrians delivered. Their engineers developed siege tactics centuries ahead of their time. Battering rams, sappers, and scaling ladders became standard tools of assault. Cities that once seemed impregnable fell in weeks, not months. But this rapid growth wasn't without its growing pains. Internal instability and succession crises frequently interrupted expansion. After the assassination of Tukulti-Ninurta I, who had conquered Babylon and dared to call himself its king, Assyria fell into temporary decline. Civil war and foreign invasions shrunk the borders. By the end of the 11th century BCE, the empire was reduced again to its heartland along the Middle Tigris, but the ideology remained. The sword of Ashur had been drawn, and even in retreat, it was kept sharp, waiting for the right moment to strike again. By the 10th century BCE, Assyria stood at a crossroads. After a century of contraction and civil unrest, it was no longer feared, only remembered. But that changed with the rise of Ashurnasirpal II, a ruler who didn't just want to restore Assyrian power. He wanted the world to tremble at its name. Ashurnasirpal II reinvented Assyrian kingship. His reign, beginning in 883 BCE, was defined not only by military campaigns, but by a psychological strategy that would become a hallmark of the empire: state terror. Cities that resisted were not just defeated, they were obliterated, their populations massacred or enslaved, and their ruins left as warnings to all others. His own inscriptions make no attempt to soften the brutality. He boasts of flaying rebels, impaling prisoners, stacking skulls in pyramids, and burning women and children alive. These were not crimes hidden in shame, they were propaganda, etched in stone, proudly displayed on palace walls. In the Assyrian worldview, fear was governance, and violence was justice. Ashurnasirpal's military expeditions were swift and strategic. He campaigned deep into the Zagros Mountains and westward toward the Mediterranean, bringing rebellious vassals back under control and annexing new territory along the way. His path of conquest was accompanied by a building frenzy back home, particularly in Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, which he transformed into a royal capital of unprecedented grandeur. His son, Shalmaneser III, inherited both the sword and the spectacle. He led over 30 military campaigns in his reign, expanding Assyrian power further into Syria, Urartu, and beyond. But his reign also marked the beginning of a new challenge. As the empire grew, so did the power of regional governors. These men, appointed to govern distant provinces, began accumulating troops, resources, and influence of their own. In time, they would become threats equal to any external enemy. The cracks deepened over the next few reigns. Dynastic squabbles and court conspiracies destabilized the capital, while provinces drifted toward autonomy. The empire still stood, but it was heavy, overextended, and starting to rot from within. By the early 8th century BCE, Assyria was once again vulnerable. Then came Tiglath-Pileser III, a general who seized the throne through a military coup in 745 BCE. What followed wasn't just a recovery, it was a revolution. Tiglath-Pileser III had understood that brutality alone couldn't hold an empire. Reform was needed. He created the world's first truly professional standing army, no longer reliant on seasonal levies from nobles or militias of citizen farmers. Soldiers were trained year-round, armed by the state, and organized into specialized units: heavy infantry, cavalry, charioteers, and engineers. He also dismantled the power of rebellious governors. Provinces were reduced in size, and their number increased. Many were now governed by eunuchs, loyal officials without families who posed no dynastic threat. To further centralize power, he reformed the tax system, making sure the flow of tribute and labor was tightly controlled from the capital. But the most chilling legacy of Tiglath-Pileser's reign was the systematic use of mass deportations. Entire populations, tens of thousands at a time, were uprooted and relocated across the empire. This was not done out of mercy or strategy. It was done to break identities. A people without their land, their temples, and their ancestors became easier to rule, easier to erase. Under Tiglath-Pileser, Assyria became not just a war machine, but a machine of control. And once it was rebuilt, it turned outward again, toward Babylon, toward Syria, toward the heartlands of its old enemies. The great predator had returned, more calculated, more efficient, and more merciless than ever. By the mid-7th century BCE, Assyria had reached the apex of its power, politically, militarily, and culturally. It had subdued Babylon, crushed Elam, and forced even Egypt to kneel. Its empire stretched from the highlands of Iran to the banks of the Nile, and standing at the center of this imperial storm was Ashurbanipal, the last truly powerful king of Assyria. Ashurbanipal ruled not only as a conqueror, but also as a scholar, a paradox in an empire built on blood. From his palace in Nineveh, he curated the largest known library of the ancient world, collecting texts in cuneiform across subjects from medicine to magic. He could read and write, unlike most kings of his time, and took pride in knowledge as much as conquest. His library, thousands of tablets strong, would later preserve the Epic of Gilgamesh and much of what we know about Mesopotamian mythology. But Ashurbanipal's reign was anything but peaceful. Internally, the seeds of destruction had already been planted by his own father, Esarhaddon, who had made the fateful decision to split the empire between his two sons, Ashurbanipal in Assyria and Shamash-Shumukin in Babylon. While this appeased Babylon's elites, who welcomed a native-born king, it introduced a fatal fault line in the heart of the empire. On the surface, the two brothers ruled in harmony. But Babylon was never content to remain a junior partner. In secret, Shamash-Shumukin began assembling a coalition: Elamites, Chaldeans, Arabs, Medes, and even mercenaries from Egypt. It was a grand alliance, a desperate bid to liberate Babylon and destroy Assyrian supremacy once and for all. In 652 BCE, the coalition launched a massive rebellion. But what looked like the beginning of Assyria's end quickly collapsed into chaos. The alliance was fragmented, poorly coordinated, and easily divided by Ashurbanipal's seasoned generals. One by one, the rebel armies were hunted down and broken. Babylon was besieged and starved for years. When it finally fell in 648 BCE, Shamash-Shumukin refused to be taken alive. He set fire to his palace, perishing in the flames alongside his court. What followed was vengeance, not victory. Babylon was desecrated, its population massacred or deported. The Elamite capital of Susa was razed, its royal tombs looted, and its king paraded through Nineveh in chains. In a chilling display of dominance, Ashurbanipal entered a temple in triumph with 5 defeated kings harnessed to his chariot like animals. Behind them, other vassals dragged the severed heads of their own kin. But despite these triumphs, the empire was already hemorrhaging. The endless wars had drained Assyria's manpower and economy. Rebellions flared faster than they could be extinguished. The very lands Assyria had once plundered, Elam, Babylon, the Levant, were now barren, their resources spent. Trade had withered, governors grew more autonomous, and new threats were gathering at the empire's brittle frontiers. Ashurbanipal's later years were marked not by expansion, but by stagnation and silence. After his death, sometime around 627 BCE, chaos erupted. Civil war broke out between his sons, generals, and regional governors. The central government, once so feared, could no longer command obedience. It could barely command itself. The empire was still standing, but the ground beneath it had already cracked. By the final decades of the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire still looked formidable on the map, but its foundations were hollow. After Ashurbanipal's death, the empire that had once dominated the Near East, like a thundercloud, fractured into competing factions: generals, royal heirs, and governors, each vying for control, each dragging their armies into civil war. What had once been a centralized machine now collapsed into internal chaos. And just beyond the empire's borders, the storm was gathering. The Medes, a rising force from the Iranian plateau, had been watching closely. So had the Babylonians, now under the leadership of a Chaldean prince named Nabopolassar, who declared Babylon's independence from Assyria in 626 BCE. The timing couldn't have been worse for Assyria, still reeling from its own succession crises and the collapse of its provincial authority. While the Medes began raiding from the east, Nabopolassar launched a full-scale war of liberation from the south. Assyria, once the invader, had become the invaded. City by city, the old imperial borders were peeled away like brittle bark. Yet still, the Assyrians clung to the hope that Nineveh, their crown jewel, was impregnable. That illusion shattered in 612 BCE. The Medes and Babylonians, now allied, descended on Nineveh with overwhelming force. After a brutal 3-month siege, the walls were breached. The city burned. King Sin-shar-ishkun perished in the fighting. Temples collapsed, palaces crumbled. The once mighty capital was reduced to ash and rubble, and with it the heart of the Assyrian state. But even then, the remnants refused to surrender. A final stand was made at Haran, where a surviving Assyrian prince, Ashur-uballit-seketh, attempted to rally what remained of the army and forge an alliance with Egypt, Assyria's old adversary turned desperate ally. For a moment it looked like Assyria might claw back a sliver of its former strength. But in 610 BCE, Haran fell. And in 609 BCE, at the Battle of Carchemish, Nabopolassar's forces, joined now by his son Nebuchadnezzar, crushed the Egyptian-Assyrian coalition. That was the final blow. Assyria, the world's first empire, the god kingdom of Ashur, the scourge of Babylon, Elam, and Egypt, ceased to exist. No final treaty was signed. No last king fled into exile. There was only silence. Within a generation the empire was gone. Its cities lay in ruins. Its gods were forgotten. Its language faded. Its monuments buried in dust. The Assyrians had once believed that Ashur's dominion was eternal. But history had other plans. The Assyrians ruled with fear and fire, and for a time it worked. Their innovations in warfare, administration, and infrastructure laid the foundations for every empire that came after. But their obsession with conquest, their brutality, and their inability to stop ultimately consumed them. Their legacy lived on, in roads, in languages, in legends. But the empire itself burned away by the very violence it used to build. If you found this journey through Assyria as intense and fascinating as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell for more deep dives into the ancient world. Until next time, remember, even the mightiest empires fall, but the stories, they last forever.